Thank you very much for joining us today for our webinar, Racial Inequalities in the Times of COVID-19, Sociological Perspectives on the Social Production of Racial Inequalities in the Canadian Context. In this panel, we will engage with a variety of sociological perspectives on race, class, and ethnicity to scrutinize the manifold ways through which racial subordination and racial exclusion have been deepening within the context of COVID-19 in Canada. We will also discuss how those inequalities have been contested by social movements and the possibilities for interracial solidarity that have emerged. The Canadian Sociological Association wishes to situate its presence and as an uninvited guest on the traditional territories of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples across to what has come to be known through a colonial project as Canada. This acknowledgement is to recognize the enduring relationships that exist between Indigenous nations and their territories that the Canadian Sociological Association and its constituents work and live on. As an organization, we strive to understand our role within Canada's ongoing settler colonial project that subjects Indigenous peoples to dispossession and genocide. We recognize our participation and complacency in colonial modalities and acknowledge systems and are committed to the colonial praxis that centers and affirms the contributions of Indigenous elders and scholars to the field of sociology. Before we get started, I should let everyone know that audience members are muted to limit background noise. If you've had questions during the panel, we encourage you to submit those through the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Your answers will be visible to all attendees and panelists and audience members as well. You can also vote questions to prioritize them. The panelists will address questions during the open Q&A period voluntary days discussion at the end of the presentation. My name is Eloy Rivas Sanchez. I am Assistant Professor of Sociology at Athabasca University and also an Adjunct Research Professor at Carleton University in Ottawa. Joining me today are three graduate students from Carleton University in alphabetic order: Camille Boucher, Sadie Gibson, and Courtney Lantier. Sorry, Courtney. Our first presentation is titled "Benevolent Racism is Fundamentally Canadian." Sorry, with Camille Boucher. I am going to turn off my camera and let Camille to do the presentation. Thank you, Camille, and welcome.
Hello, everybody. Yes, my name is Camille, and I will be presenting on benevolent racism and how I believe that it is a fundamentally Canadian attribute. And I'm having some technical difficulties already. There we go. So this presentation aims to connect the oversight of impoverished and racialized communities during the COVID-19 pandemic. I argue that Canada's tendency to use liberal rhetoric and continued denial or dismissal of a settler colonial heritage leaves the public deeply protective of a self-defined, tolerant, and multicultural identity while reaping the benefits of racial capitalism. By reframing structural discrimination as instances of interpersonal racism, systems of governance are able to relinquish responsibility and accountability for discrimination, which is evidenced in the higher concentration of COVID cases in the BIPOC community. I'll begin by breaking down some of the theoretical lenses that contextualize how I interpret the disproportionate levels of COVID infections in racialized citizens. First, looking at the presence of colonialism as a structure in Canada, followed by methods of deflection that have been adopted to deny accountability. So a determinant of settler colonialism is that it is not an event, but it's a structure. It is a continuous bureaucratic organization that requires the need for expansion through the forceful erasure and dispossession of a native people and exploitation and disenfranchisement of select residents and visual minorities. This structure forces oppressed peoples or oppressed groups to rely on and depend strictly on the oppressor's governance and a need to assimilate for survival. To clarify the difference between colonialism and settler colonialism, Veracini points out that they are not only different, but antithetical. Dispossession, genocide, disenfranchisement, and depoliticization are not singular quantifiable events because they are instruments of two distinct colonial relationships of inequality that involve land and the exploitation of immigrants centering on labor. This means the primary characteristics of colonialism are grounded in an exploitative capitalist inequality and a claim over land. Where colonialism depends on the exploitation of Black and Native peoples, settler colonialism aims to eliminate them. Canada's history of exogenous domination, paired with the current trends of neoliberal policies, can be labeled neo-settler colonialism, which Jacobi and Spadia determine is a new form of regime that advances colonial projects while using the neoliberal toolbox of concepts and policies, for example, privatization, decentralization, deregulation, and free market, as a mask that conceals the continued presence of old colonial logic. A secondary but necessary component of capitalist fervors is a social process of binary categorizations and being able to claim some as less than the hegemonic norm. This othering process is necessary for the justification of expropriation and exploitation of Black and Indigenous peoples in North America, and continues beyond the ending of slavery and colonization. It was only in 1962 that Canada's Immigration Act removed all reference to race, ethnicity, or geographical areas in the determination of those eligible for citizenship, officially ending nearly 100 years of racial segregation by the Federal Department of Immigration, only to be followed by the points-based system in 1967. The changes in immigration policy with the changes in immigration policy, the proportion of Canada's population that has been born in Asia, Africa, the West Indies, or Latin America rose from 1.7 to 10.4% between 1971 and 2001, while visual minorities grew from 4.7 to 13.4% between 1981 and 2001. But a rapid pivot in policy does not mean that social practices evolve in tandem. And current trends show that the country's students and population at large are unaware of the country's fundamentally racist history and practices. In reality, a curated rhetoric is used to soften the racist Canadian sentiment and ultimately manipulate the status quo to deny the very real presence of racism. Shushowitz found that about 16% of Canadians are hardcore xenophobes, and about 1/4 of the population is flirting with intolerance. Key terms like race, racism, and racist are frequently absent and replaced with intolerance, discrimination, and less compassionate, among other euphemisms. The depiction of Canadians as intolerant rather than racist allows for interpretations to be attributed to individual acts of overt but occasional prejudice and discrimination rather than systemic racism as a Canadian attribute. This is the phenomenon that I've labeled as benevolent. Shifting racist discrimination from neo-settler colonial framework to a realm of personal failing and poor character allows the systemic issue to be reduced to individual instances. The self-proclaimed multicultural identity acts as a deflective shield for continued exploitation, segregation, and for other discriminatory practices to be swept under the rug and blatantly denied. By making accounts ahistorical, for example, their reference in contemporary context makes them seem far more distant than they really are. This is a tool also used in the reconciliation efforts of the cultural genocide of Indigenous peoples and is being repeated during the COVID pandemic. Patterns of racialized poverty in Canada are continuous and widespread for those who have been here for centuries. This suggests that economic and social barriers inhibit social mobility for Canada's visual minorities. Canada's settler colonial history solidifies these systemic processes through capitalist and neoliberal pursuits. Ruth Wilson Gilmore discerns that racialized populations have been subject to organized abandonment, where neoliberal markets accelerate a separation from the welfare state and deem them largely expendable through racial capitalism. Angela Davis also points out that dehumanizing systems and processes impact mobility, civil participation, and make racialized people the enemies of society. In numerous ways, the American capitalist model of democracy is not only far from achievable for most, but it actually perpetuates global trends of racialized poverty. Ethnic segregation in Canadian metropolises is commonly lumped into community enclaves. In Toronto, for example, the neighborhoods with higher densities of one cultural or ethnic background are more often associated with higher poverty rates and low income employment. And Watson Bourne suggests that Aboriginals and recent immigrants from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean in particular are increasingly likely to live in ghetto or underclass neighborhoods. These are largely the same countries of origin that have seen an increase in immigration since the early 1970s and between the early 1970s and early 2000s. So how is this more obvious with COVID? While the tools of denial for dismissal of systemic racism continues to be used in public rhetoric and severely impacts racialized communities through lack of care, prioritization, and continued exploitation during the pandemic. Members of these communities routinely fall between the cracks, and this is directly evidenced by the concentration of positive COVID-19 cases. We are able to see patterns of favoritism for the Caucasian hegemonic citizens, which is worded as in Ontario health reports as Canadian-born or long-term residents, while racialized communities face intensifying infection rates. According to a Statistics Canada report entitled COVID-19 mortality rates in Canada and other, Canada's ethnocultural neighborhoods, visual minorities are at a higher risk of COVID due to poverty, overcrowding housing conditions, and working in occupations associated with greater risk of exposure. Gendered and racialized work are key components to understanding these patterns of COVID infections in the GTA. A 2020 report by Gutman et al. Suggests that amongst the 36% of female healthcare workers with positive COVID infections, 45% of those are immigrants and refugees. They also detail that immigrants, refugees, and other newcomers account for 43.5% of all COVID cases in Ontario, while they only make up 25% of the population. This supports the aforementioned theories, where communities with the highest COVID infection rates are those who, because of their race, are funneled into low-skilled, low-paying jobs that for men of color tends to be manual labor, and for women of color, it's service or domestic labor. Both are associated with higher risk of exposure to the virus, and both are likely to be in the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. The lack of attention to these communities who are known to be of higher risk should not be confused for misguided oversight, as this is precisely the denial and dismissal of racialized people's issues that makes Canada's benevolent racism particularly dangerous. So in conclusion, the influences of settler colonial heritage continue to impact the racialized and marginalized organization of the population, and multicultural diversity is not enough to substantiate an anti-racist identity. The pandemic has undoubtedly placed considerable yet varying pressures on all Canadians. However, those who under normal circumstances already face precarities and systemic oppressions, the experience is amplified. It is not enough to claim cultural diversity and simultaneously deem select socio-demographic identities as expendable for the greater good. While the pandemic may be novel, the structural patterns are not, but they're evident now more than ever. With the interest of time, I had some final notes and future research considerations, but I think I will leave those until later for the question period, if they come up. And if not, then we'll move on. But I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank the Canadian Sociological Association for the opportunity to present this research. And I'd like to thank my mentors and my friends and family who have attended today in order to show their support and their interest in the subject. And I will be passing off, I guess, the screen to Sadie at this point.
Yeah,
Thank you again.
Yeah, the next is Sadie. Go ahead, Sadie. With disposable bodies, migrant labor, racial capitalism, and the global COVID pandemic. Thank you very much, Camille, for your awesome presentation.
Sorry, I forgot to hit unmute. But thank you guys so kindly for coming. I will share my screen momentarily with everybody. And there we are. So this presentation will investigate and seek to critically engage with migrant labor schemes utilizing the Canadian Temporary Foreign Worker Program, which will be referred to often as the TFWP, as a frame of analysis. A central argument I intend to make in this presentation is that racial capitalism is evidenced in the Canadian Temporary Foreign Worker Program, which renders migrants as disposable bodies in Canada's embrace of low-wage migrant labor. The evidence of the hyper-commodification and exploitation of migrant laborers and their bodies is further illustrated by the global pandemic, which in Canada has resulted in a new visibility of such inequalities and the catastrophic outcomes that result from failed protections and failed policies within these initiatives. This presentation intends to display that the 2020-2021 global pandemic has further illustrated that disposability and racial capitalism are both part and parcel of migrant labor schemes, specifically that of the Canadian Temporary Foreign Worker Program. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the inequalities and inequities experienced amongst migrant laborers in profound ways, which highlights the lack of pre-existing worker protections resulting from failure to install systems. To begin this presentation, I would like to be clear on what I am referring to, and that is of disposability and of exactly when this shift begun. In 2008, there was a drastic influx in migrant laborers entering Canada that for the first time exceeded the amount of permanent resident foreign labor workers. And then for disposability, what I am referring to is the Marxian concept of disposability. And within this context of migrant labor schemes, it renders humans as human waste and expendable within the settler colonial relationship they have within the Canadian nation state. And then legitimate citizenship versus deportable migrant laborers within this situation involves the elimination of racialized Canadians through politics of exclusions that marginalize racialized individuals. I chose this picture to show to you guys, to share with you all, because a lot of the literature on disposability comes from the literature on Indigenous citizens in Canada and their problematic relationship with the Canadian nation state. So within the Canadian Temporary Foreign Worker Program, the bulk of whom are entering Canada are within the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program, which accounts for the majority of migrant laborers. And within this program, there are politics of exclusion which deny migrant laborers access to citizenship, access to permanent residency, while there have been breaths of areas where we've been optimistic, where they are allowing now migrant laborers in the temporary foreign worker program to seek full-time residency. This is only for migrant laborers that can speak fluently either English or French, which the bulk of the seasonal agricultural worker program migrant laborers cannot meet that expectation due to being from rural communities that do not have access to education streams that would provide them with the skills to be able to speak fluently. And additionally, in these programs, there's an establishment of dependency on the employer because of the profound and problematic relationship with the and their employers. Moving forward. These are some statistics to break down from 2020 from Statistics Canada that break down where the migrant laborers are located within the Canadian workforce. And you can see 27.4 of those migrant laborers are going to be taking up the agricultural sector, while 9.8 take up domestic labor, and then so forth. Within this scheme, you see these job locations of domestic labor and agricultural labor as being described as dirty jobs, the jobs that Canadians don't deem themselves as wanting to take up any longer, which result in Canada's embrace of low-wage migrant labor in the wake of Canadian resistance towards work deemed dirty. Racial capitalism is evidenced within this system in both the exploitation and expropriation of racialized bodies. Racialization of dirty jobs becomes both part and parcel of this system as well, within our embrace of these low-wage jobs that we now give to othered Canadian citizens. And this continues to perpetuate the othering of racialized populations through the market economy practices that we see happening within these spaces, and the human waste as the labor market deemed fit for these dirty jobs becomes very notorious within these systems, that is very problematic and limiting in our embrace of migrant labor in Canada. So within the COVID-19 pandemic context, in March of 2020, migrants were able to enter Canada while travel restrictions occurred, highlighting the attachment Canada has on migrant labor, the dependency that you can see visible within who we allow entry and who we do not. During March of 2020, Canada expanded employer rights within the SWAP program. So that's the agricultural program, to allow for ease of use of this program and allow for deeper access to migrant labor within this program and this initiative, which highlights how dependent we've become on cheap and exploitable labor and cheap and exploitable bodies. And then there have been additional COVID-19 changes to provide services. The federal government has provided access to various fundings. The budget of 2021 allocated $57.6 million to extend the mandatory isolation support for temporary foreign worker program to August 31st, 2021, which highlights the attachment that Canada has with this program and with these exploitable bodies, and that they're willing to fund these programs because these initiatives are so attractive to Canada. Support of up to $1,500 per worker would be provided to employers until June 15th, 2021 for some of the costs associated with the mandatory 14-day isolation period. After June 15th, 2021, employers would receive $750 per worker until the program ends on August 31st, 2021. So these fundings really highlight that Canada is very much attached to this program and is very much entrenched with the logics of this program, which I think is important to note, as well as the various cases that we've seen come out of the devastating consequences of poor worker protections and poor living and working conditions that these programs have provided for the individuals that they host. So there have been breaths of optimism. Ontario is set to vaccinate 200 migrant workers arriving from Mexico upon arrival from plane, which is an exciting initiative and is something to think of as a breath of optimism and as a breath of moving forward in the right direction. There have been increased calls to install credible oversight overseen by migrant labor activist organizations as opposed to Canadian government organizations, because we have continued to see that the Canadian government fails to install credible oversight. There's a push to create further safety installations within facilities and workplaces migrant laborers inhabit, as well as their living arrangements. There's an increased public awareness of racism directed towards migrant laborers in the often rural communities they inhabit, which is another very exciting breath of optimism that we can look to in the future as something positive towards social change, which is very exciting and positive. In my conclusion, while I did not detail this enough, I would like to say that racial capitalism is both part and parcel of migrant labor schemes as evidenced within the Canadian template. Migrant laborers risk their bodies for the profiteering of settler colonialism within Canada's embrace of low-wage migrant labor. Therefore, they have to train their bodies to be able to handle the type of labor required by the Canadian labor market. The Canadian Temporary Foreign Worker Program continues to highlight who Canada does and furthermore does not want as a citizen, which is an important concept to this project. The global pandemic has exacerbated inequalities within the Canadian Temporary Foreign Worker Program and really illustrates all of the various issues that are taking place as a result of this program. And I hope that this presentation is generative of something useful for all of my attendees. And I will pass it on to Courtney, who is our next presenter.
Hello, Courtney. Are you there? This is the turn of Courtney Lanthier, who is crafting an argument about reparations, an argument that hasn't been very common in Canada, and we are very excited to hear you.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I was trying to manage full screening and then taking off my video. I'm Courtney. I'm just finishing up my first year of my master's program at Carleton's Institute of Political Economy. I'm glad to be here. My research is really more focused on food security, gender, and critical measurement, but this is a topic that I've been interested in since my undergraduate days. So whenever I get the chance to pursue it, I try to. So, the title of this research paper is Unequal Pathways to Success, a case for reparations for Black Canadians. And it stems from a really short seminar paper I wrote commenting on Robin Maynard's Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada from Slavery to the Present, which I expanded into a research project last semester. And then Eloy approached me about presenting it here with a COVID-19 context. And so I think it's very fitting to talk about it again now. And so in that book about police violence, Maynard does get into some of the more, instances of really overt police violence, but she also brings up areas where, um, state violence against Black Canadians is a little bit more implicit or concealed. And that really informs how I conceptualize reparations and also how I conceptualize this paper here, which I sort of organize it into three core areas of social reproduction. And this includes education, work and labor, and income or socioeconomic stratification. So essentially what I'm exploring is a crisis in social reproduction for Black individuals and communities in those specific areas that I mentioned. Of course, unsurprisingly, COVID-19 has exacerbated this crisis in these sectors and in health and well-being areas. And for me, really, revives the need for a more focused consideration of reparations, which I will get into more as the presentation goes on. But first, I'd like to spend a couple of minutes situating Canada in this conversation and speaking to some of the statistics in those three areas that I just mentioned from the pre-COVID days. And then I'll bring up some COVID-19 statistics and how they've changed over the past year as a way of making my argument for reparations. And just before I get into it, you'll note that I have a couple of graphs throughout the presentation, but I also have additional information in my presentation that I don't include on the screen, just for the sake of making the presentation not 5,000 slides long. So if you're wondering, that's why. So the reparations conversation here in Canada has been far less prevalent than it has been in the United States. As you heard in Camille's presentation, we Canadians often think of ourselves as, benevolent racists, not really sort of overt or blatant racists, and we think of really anti-Black racism as something that's more American than Canadian. And I would suspect this sort of benevolent racism feel that we have about ourselves is the reason we really haven't addressed this issue in Canada, and we pay so little attention to reparations, slavery, and Black Canadians in general. So, reparations, what it is that, a public apology and compensation for past injustices is really often conceptualized in terms of slavery, and really more often than not American slavery. But slavery existed in Canada for more than 200 years until 1834, I believe. And so, while we do have that slavery past, I think that it's important to say that I think the conversation of reparations needs to be more inclusive of injustices that have taken place post-slavery and injustices that are taking place now. The conversation really can't encompass only those few hundred years when slavery existed. So my argument is essentially twofold. Firstly, that in the absence of action taken by the state, they're essentially the Canadian government is essentially sanctioning this inequality that is pervasive for so many Black Canadians. And secondly, that reparations and policy alternatives are needed to lift up Black Canadians and consciously improve access to high quality education, work and labor opportunities, and access to the sort of financial institutions that help mitigate that crisis in social reproduction. So building on some of the American and brief Canadian conversations about reparations, I decided to use those three areas that I mentioned, education, work and labor, and income, to give this conversation some scope. And so I'm analyzing, you'll hear about it in a minute, but I'm going to analyze statistics to explore the degree to which slave era labor patterns and systemic racism today inform the opportunities available to Black Canadians. And so, in this research, I'm really drawing on Statistics Canada's 2020 reports on Canada's Black population, which explores education, labor, and resilience. Bringing it back to Maynard, in her book, Policing Black Lives, she explores how these stereotypes from slave era labor patterns and that have just persisted throughout time dehumanize Black children and have rendered the educational experience for them one that is characterized by heightened surveillance, discrimination, and mistreatment. And so Statistics Canada indicates that Black students prior to the pandemic were overrepresented in numbers of students with specialized education plans and underrepresented in those students labeled as gifted. So within these specialized plans, students receive less resources and are steered away from higher institutions, university and so forth, and are often actually steered towards more menial tasks or jobs that require less education. So according to that same report that I just mentioned, 94% of Black youth would like to achieve a university degree, as you can see on the screen, compared to 82% in the rest of the population. However, only 60% of Black students actually believe that they will achieve one, compared to 79% in the rest of the population. And I don't have a graph about it, but that report goes on to discuss a study that was conducted in Toronto of more than 200,000 respondents, in which Black men and women between the ages of 25 and 59, and states that they were half as likely to hold a university degree than the rest of the population. Despite this, Black youth whose parents do hold university degrees still report less favorable educational outcomes than the rest of the population whose parents do and do not have university degrees. Education is really just one piece of the puzzle, even though in my mind it's the most important. Black Canadians are also overrepresented in 3D jobs, dirty, dangerous, and demeaning, as you heard Sadie talk about. Black women specifically are overrepresented in the informal labor market, which is characterized by low wages, lack of security, lack of control, little or no benefits, vacation pay, pensions, and so on. Black women specifically are more likely to be driven to this market, the informal labor market, despite the fact that they are statistically better off in terms of holding a university degree as compared to Black men. And prior to the pandemic, Black individuals had about a 3.9% higher unemployment rate than the rest of the population, and 1 in 5 Black adults lived in low-income situations. So to bring in this COVID-19 context, the disproportionately negative effects of COVID on Black Canadians is wildly evident when you look at the infection rates, mortality rates, and outbreak hotspots. Statistics Canada indicated in a study in Montreal and Toronto, for example, that infection and mortality rates are higher where there are instances and concentrations of Black citizens. So as you can see on the screen here, comparing mortality rates in Black community population areas and South Asian population areas, you can see that Black Canadians face almost double the likelihood of dying from COVID-19. And oftentimes we sort of hear these statistics discussed without really any further context or examination, and that really incites a lot of racism and blame for infection rates and just blame generally for COVID-19. But further examination of the social conditions that have led to these statistics tells a very different story. Health stats like this do not exist independently of some of the more social aspects like education and income that I have explored in this research. There are a number of contributing factors that result in uneven infection and mortality rates, including the fact that infection and mortality rates are higher in apartment buildings and dwellings that host more than one core family unit. Black Canadians are also overrepresented in frontline and essential services, including healthcare, food, and accommodation industries, just to name a few. And so the inability to isolate and work from home contributes significantly to uneven infection numbers. So as you can see, COVID-19 has exacerbated an already prevalent crisis in social reproduction. And the data I draw on here and in the rest of the presentation is from Statistics Canada's 6 month and 1 year follow-ups to the social and economic inequalities of COVID-19. So in that 6-month update, 20% of all frontline workers are Black compared to 14% in the rest of the population. 25% of Black Canadians make less than $16 an hour versus 16% in the non-visible minority or Indigenous population. The poverty rate among Black Canadians is 20% versus 9% in the non-visible minority or Indigenous population. And the unemployment rate 1 year out of the pandemic for Black Canadians is roughly 16.4% rather than 8.9% in the non-visible minority or Indigenous population, which is almost double what it was just prior to the pandemic. And among those Canadians struggling financially, 1 year into the pandemic, Black Canadians reported at about a 33% chance versus 16% in the non-minority or Indigenous populations. And of course, low-wage workers have been hit the hardest by these lockdowns. By the end of 2020, employment opportunities decreased by 39% for those who worked in the lowest waged jobs. But in the highest wage jobs, they experienced a 16% increase in opportunity. And of course, unsurprisingly, youth are affected most in these lockdowns on top of being in low wage jobs. Youth unemployment skyrocketed to 29% in May of 2020, despite having a relatively steady number of 10.4% in January and February, just prior to the pandemic. So we now have the highest recorded number of youth not employed or in school than we have had in 20 years. And despite mostly online delivery systems, tuition fees have increased, making it even more prohibitive to get higher education and advance your career. So for me, the Canadian state really needs to address these systemic inequalities, particularly for those Black youth who are at the beginning of their academic and professional and personal lives. And so to tie it back into reparations, it's important to note that reparations are so much more than an apology and a check. For reparations to work for the long term, they cannot come at the expense of other social programming. The Canadian government needs to support Black Canadians in addition to providing reparations, and this can come in multiple forms. All public institutions need to be captured in this kind of endeavor. So some of the policy changes that I explore in this research and that I draw on others to make my conclusions are, for example, scholarships for Black students at any level of education, not just post-secondary, scholarships that aren't time burdensome and prohibitive to complete, prorated tuition for Black students, incentives and returns for first-time Black homebuyers that are additional to the already pre-existing incentives for homebuyers in some provinces. And some of the other more general supports that I think would benefit all Canadians, but particularly are relevant here, are universal childcare, senior care, living wage public retirement plans for those workers who are in low-wage sectors that just don't have the opportunity to save in a way that will provide a quality retirement, and so many more. So the disbursement of money, just handing out checks without really addressing the systemic issues that have generated these problems in the first place, really only gives Black Canadians a marginally financial better chance at accessing services and products that are already exclusive, already experience systemic racism, and are privatized. It does nothing to plan for the long term. And so I'll close by stating that something that we often hear around this conversation, particularly in the American context, is that, I wasn't alive during slavery, and neither were you. Why should I have to pay for it? Why should we burden our budget and our economy with it? But to that I would say, consider the ways in which slave-era labor patterns and subsequent systemic racism continue to actively inform the opportunities in terms of education and work and labor to Black Canadians still today. So, this crisis in social reproduction really does need to be addressed on all fronts. Thank you. And I want to thank both the CSA for putting out this opportunity for us, and also for Eloy, who thought of me in including my research in this presentation.
Here we go. I think, there we go. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I am going to talk. It's been very exciting to hear Courtney's, Sadie, and Camille presentations, because we met in a seminar that I taught at Carleton University on race, class, and ethnicity in 2000 and last year in September. And so, little by little, we started crafting arguments. And for me, it's extremely exciting and not only exciting, but inspiring to see a new generation of anti-racist scholars or sociologists and political economists developing this anti-racist solidarity, thinking race from the alterity as well, right? And so this is exciting for me. I am going to share with you ideas and hypotheses that I have developed through my my continuous involvement and work with solidarity across borders, with several groups of undocumented workers that I have been working with for now 8 years around. My presentation is called Interracial Solidarity in the Times of COVID. Here it is. Interracial solidarity in the times of COVID. I'm sorry, I don't know how to. Yeah, it should be there like that. Oh. It's gonna take a second before I put myself all together. Okay, so yeah, it's basically about, I think, about how the grassroots politics in the context of COVID are reinventing a new form of politics, a form of politics that is based in solidarity, a form of politics that is based on a critique of the settler colonial state, and a new kind of politics that put in the center of their political praxis the protection of life and the practice of radical love. And so it is something that I am trying to do through, while crafting a kind of a sociology of hope. We are living in a very grim times in which, life is under threat in every corner of the world. And so it is a time, I think, to use sociological lenses, to use our sociological imagination and insights to try to collect information that give us a little bit of information about how new forms of politics may emerge in the future, and how this can actually be able to produce another social order, a social order that overcomes racism, exploitation, domination, misrecognition, and all those ills that are produced by racial capitalism, as was mentioned by Xavier. So the picture that you will see here, I'm going to show a lot of pictures, have been taken by, here I have it, by Ion Exterria, by myself, by Sarka Bankurova, and they are part of the digital archives of solidarity across borders. I enter into the field, into the clandestine world of the undocumented population in Canada now 8 years ago. I entered first as a factory worker in Montreal, in Leamington, then as a research assistant from several projects with Canadian scholars. And then when I started doing my doctoral studies at Carleton University, I entered there with support of Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and with the ethics approval from Carleton University to interview my co-workers and to provide a picture, an ethnography that shows the challenges, the mental and physical health challenges that undocumented population in Montreal faces. And this is with the idea of showing how precarious labor and status and migrant status shape the physical and mental health of the people living in this our country. And so my presentation is going to have 4 parts. In the first part, I am going to talk a little bit about the crisis of the social reproduction that is being living, under which undocumented populations in Montreal are being living during COVID. I am going to talk the responses from civil society, from Canadian organizations, and from the undocumented workers as well to that crisis of social reproduction. Then I am going to talk about how those struggles, those responses to the crisis from below have been reinventing new forms of politics from which we can actually learn a lot if we want to really produce knowledge aimed at framing a new kind of democratic and inclusive society. And then at the end, I'm gonna just mention a few words about what I would like to see in the future for my own work and the work of others, which is kind of a crafting a sociology of hope. All right, so I use the concept that is already mentioned by Courtney, the concept of social reproduction that was crafted by Canadian political economists, by feminists fundamentally, that understands social reproduction as the capacities of populations to reproduce themselves and to reproduce the basis of the economy, the material economy, including the household economy. And so the social reproduction includes or involves access to material means of subsistence like food, housing, healthcare, water, jobs, and so on, but also include access to non-material means of subsistence, love, recognition, and respect, among others that are important for us to reproduce ourselves, to reproduce our subjectivities in conditions that are not blessed or disrespected. It includes also the social struggles, the collective labor in which we are engaged to carry out in the daily basis to guarantee the intergenerational regeneration of others, domestic labor, care and effective labor, and also what we do with communities to have access to those social goods. When I was doing my fieldwork in Montreal, and this is documented in my doctoral thesis that is called the Portability, Labor and Health in Canada's Late Capitalism, I painted a kind of a green picture of the lives of the undocumented population in Montreal, my co-workers at that time. Basically, what I portrayed was a picture of people who were mostly, there was a diversity, but mostly separated, estranged from Canadian society. And there are 3 reasons that shape this kind of isolation and estrangement from Canadian society, that shape the crisis of social reproduction that I painted in my doctoral dissertation. And one is that they are working all the time. Labor is the only thing that they have to reproduce themselves. And so engagement in labor, any kind of labor at any time, is extremely important for their survival. And so that kind of a subsumption of labor on the conditions of precarity prevents them from accessing to friendship, from learning languages, from being recognized as being part of society. And though, because of the fact that they work in precarious labor, I also documented lack of food security, scarcity of or rupture of social networks, scarcity of love and social recognition, and also difficulties to care for themselves and from others, and also limited access to healthcare. So that was kind of the picture that I showed before the pandemic, but I have continued working with them, and through the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, I have been actually volunteering a lot with Solidarity Across Borders and with the permit, taking pictures, doing interviews with some people who were my co-workers, who are now people that I know and who I owe a lot of respect, and I try to pay back what they did when I was doing my field work. So I have been continuing in contact, in collaboration, and this is what I have learned. Now, under the COVID-19, I see that the crisis of social reproduction that I painted and portrayed in my doctoral thesis is actually is worse now, right? And just for the reason that kind of I guess are obvious for all of us now, underemployment, unemployment, and shortage of labor is very hard among the undocumented population. Is not the exception. A lot of them are not working these days. There is a deep isolation, the curfew, for example, that prevents people from being outside in the night, and most of the undocumented workers have to work at night, put them into a deep isolation, fear of deportation. They have no access whatsoever, as you see in the image on the right, no access whatsoever to any kind of an employment benefit, to any kind of the Canadian emergency response benefits. They fear going to the healthcare services to ask for vaccines, to check their health, because they are fearful of being deported. Even though the Canadian government has said, everybody can have access to healthcare services, they are fearful of that because of fears of being deported. Food insecurity is incredible, it's more than ever, and they have no access to remittances. They can't send money to their homes. For those reasons, they are facing what I call a transnational crisis of social reproductions that I will define as difficulties to access the material and non-material basic needs necessary to sustain themselves and their families in Canada and also in their countries of origin. So they are not only the ones facing the crisis of social reproduction now, but also their families in their countries of origin, because they are not receiving also money from them, from remittances. And so this has created, of course, created a exacerbated racial and health inequalities in Canadian society. It has created a division among those who are considered essential workers versus not essential workers, has created more a misrecognition of the essential labor that is provided by undocumented populations. It has exacerbated food insecurity among people, our neighbors, and also exacerbated the very powerful role and very negative role that borders represent for undocumented population. But there are people doing a lot of stuff to overcome the crisis, and I am going to talk a little bit about that. What I have been documenting through my work with Solidarity Across Borders and the undocumented populations is that there are kind of three forms of struggles that are being carried out today and nowadays. And one of those responses aim at struggles for recognition, right? We want, they say, the Canadian government to recognize the very important role that undocumented population play in our society, and therefore to grant them with a status for all. In this moment in which we all need from each other, we have to take care of each other. There are people left behind. They are the undocumented. They are also essential. We have to provide them with access for all. This is one form of the struggle, a form of response is a struggle for recognition. You have here some pictures. I think you are gonna see it. I don't know why I can't put it, the next one. I think, okay, here we go. It's another picture from the protests that have been carried out since last year, demanding a status for all. In Montreal, this is part of the protest. We are all essential. organized also for by Solidarity Across Borders. And there is another form of response that are carried out that is very meaningful to register sociologically. And they are struggles for redistribution and for the creation of mutual aid networks, for autonomous networks that provide mutual aid, that provide solidarity and help to those who have been left behind in the context of the pandemic. And so in that context, you see a lot of people, Caucasian population, people, Canadian citizens, people from all kind of ethnicities, sexual orientation, ages, skin colors, conducting fundraising in cash to redistribute among those who are unemployed and have no access to the SERV and other social benefits. You're right, you have a fundraising campaign that is ongoing by Solidarity Across Borders. I believe Solidarity Across Borders has redistributed around $60,000 for undocumented people who have no access to employment nowadays. And all that because the Canadian population have been pinching in, have been providing some money for those people. And also they have been collecting and distributing food, masks, and health supplies and rallies, and also in homes. It's amazing the quantity of people who are now enlisted as part of the voluntary support list in Solidarity Across Borders, who go in bikes with their mask in their cars or by walking, distributing food, health supplies, and money to those who can't pay the rent, who can't access to food at this moment. It's just really amazingly, as a personal level, it's sometimes something that I even don't believe it, how beautiful it is to see those forms of responses from Canadian society and for the population at this moment. And so the other form of response that I see is forms of interracial solidarity and radical love that have been strengthening in the context of the pandemic. You know, as you can see in the images here, people from Southeast Asian women in solidarity, undocumented workers, senior citizens from different racialized ethnic groups in solidarity, also speaking up in support of the undocumented population. And through these kind of forms of solidarity from people who are actually not in need to be outside taking risks because they are citizens, they have access to everything, I see the enacting of what we call the radical law, right? Cornel West, a Black scholar from the United States who has theorized the concept of radical laws, this says that in the practice of radical law, you are embracing human beings across the board, but you do give a preference to the last of these, the most vulnerable. That includes poor whites and poor browns, as well as the poor in Black ghettos. And so as you see in this beautiful image, it's the poem of image, a senior citizen, Caucasian citizen, senior citizen, actually a university professor, is speaking in behalf and support of the undocumented population who are organizing a march to Ottawa to demand the Canadian government to grant them with status. And you see here more images that portrays what I try to call the forms of interracial solidarity that are emerging from below now. People from North Africa, from South Asia, from Africa Sub-Sahariana, from Latin America, people from all over the globe, diasporas who have been living here, and indigenous people also in support. No one is illegal. Canada in stolen land, Canada is illegal. You know, indigenous population have been also very active and supportive of the undocumented population. This is something that has been happening for a long time, but now is more is going on as well. I have 3 minutes and I don't want to go into details, but all this suggests, this is an hypothesis that I have, it's a working hypothesis, that what is in the making now is the insurrection of subjugated knowledges that Foucault documented or discussed in his lecture in January 1776, which is very famous, which is a lecture about the insurrection of subjugated knowledges, which he conceptualized as historical contents, as block of historical knowledges that, because of the ascendancy of particular forms of knowledge that became hegemonic in a particular historical moment, became subjugated, became masked and buried by those knowledges. He said, some forms of practices, normally coming from society, from civil society, have the possibility to resurrect, to revive those subjugated knowledges. And I think those are the knowledges that were subjugated under neoliberal capitalism that have been able to be revived by these struggles that I have been trying to talk about with you. One is the idea of mutual aid and solidarity. As you write, you see that as a block of historical knowledge or as a class project, neoliberalism subjugated ideas of mutual aid and solidarity based on the myth of the autonomous entrepreneurial individual who can get ahead by himself or herself, and by focusing on individual responsibility from failure and success. We are all have to be Superman, superheroes, and we don't need from others. And so this, when these organizations enact the practice of mutual aid and solidarity, they are reviving a block of historical knowledge, a formal practice that was buried, that was subjugated under neoliberalism. Neoliberalism also dismantled the conditions for redistribution, both from the social fabric and the political thought. And this is something that feminists have discussed a lot, particularly Nancy Fraser. And the ideas of redistribution at some point became kind of a bad word for in our social world. And now these organizations are openly talking about the importance of redistribute the social wealth that is being socially produced for those who have been left behind. Interracial solidarity sometimes it is forgotten that was the basis of class and ethnic alliances in the 60s and the 40s and the 30s of the last centuries. It was the basis upon which actually unions like Industrial Workers of the World in advanced capitalist society created class power, created links with different racialized groups. But then, as Xiaobei Shen, the professor in sociology at Carleton University, has demonstrated, multicultural governance at some point separate each other from Canadian society, atomize ethnicities, keep them apart, separated from each other on the idea of tolerance to ontological difference. So interracial solidarity, even though it was something that had happened in the past, has become buried and subjugated and has become alive now through the COVID-19 pandemic, through these forms of activism by solidarity across borders and undocumented population. The act of radical love, which was part of the practices in the cycle of social movements in the 60s, as has been documented by several social movement theorists, was also buried, because now we have to admire the bravest one, the most capable, and they have to be emulated. In radical love, the act of embracing the poor and the vulnerable became something like démodé. Now it's being practiced again, it's being revived. And also something that actually is the point that I would like to develop in my future research is that, as I am from Latin America, in Latin America, it was developed a form of sociological thought that is called the philosophy of liberation. It was developed by several scholars, but one of them, the most important, probably the most prominent, his name is Enrique Dussel. Enrique Dussel says that modernity and neoliberal capitalism practiced politics as a form of domination and as a form of rational administration of the social life. Under neoliberal capitalism, politics subordinated human life to profit. My contention is that this work that has been produced by undocumented population in the times of the pandemic and by grassroots organizations such as Solidarity across borders is actually creating a form of politics. They are reinventing politics and creating politics as a collective activity that serves life. I call them life-enhancing politics. It's a form of politics that tries to overcome racism, misrecognition, exploitation, to make a critique of the settled colonial state, and to make alliances with indigenous population, and at the end of the day, to create a society in which we are all free, we are all relate to each other in a nice way. I think I just did a minute to close my conversation. What is the role, or should be the role, of sociology in this context in which they are so much suffering, in which life is under threat? I think one of our labor should be locate and make available to the public the grassroots political practices that are prefigurating new social relations aimed at protecting, reproducing life beyond domination, beyond subordination, beyond misrecognition, beyond mistreatment, and to make critique possible to reveal subjugated knowledges and commit sociology of hope, right? I think the first way to do this is by actually to look at what those stories can tell us about the society that is in the making, and to participate in those efforts by committing sociology of hope. Thank you very much, and I'm gonna finish sharing my presentation. Well, I am the one who is in charge of this moving the bottoms here. So I have two questions from the audience. The first one is from Catherine Bishoping, who says, Camille mentioned future directions for her research. I am curious to hear more about those. So Camille, you have a question there, and oh no, and Catherine also says, you know, actually I'm interested in all of you three to talk about the future direction for research. So the questions are there. Who wants to start to answer them?
I think it makes sense to go in the order of the presentations if Camille is open to that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So with what I was concerned about in terms of future considerations or things to consider specifically with the language usage that is frequently adopted in Canada as a way of kind of deflecting or denying settler colonialism or its presence, is that when we become accustomed to hearing things like Canada born or born in Canada or immigrant or recent immigrants and things like intolerance versus racist, there's already an image in mind when you're hearing these words, and when it is to the point of shifting accountability from structural issues to personal or interpersonal ones, then my concern is that this is going to broaden the gap even more than it already is, because there is such an because we've become accustomed to it and we've kind of accepted it as the norm. So in terms of this language usage and how it's being presented in COVID already, what I've become concerned with is the access to vaccinations, which we're already seeing is disproportionately accessible to white hegemonic Caucasian hegemonic citizens. And this is seen in Toronto, for example, where the neighborhoods that are getting the most vaccinated are those that are, for example, like in the Rosedale area, or I think Thornhill was another one. And those are neighborhoods that are already affluent. And then when you compare them to neighborhoods that are hotspots and are inhabited by people who are at highest risk of exposure and positive infection rates, they're not getting the same level of vaccinations. And something that I was considering with this as well is we're starting to see vaccination passports, or vaccine passports, I believe is what they're called. So in terms of widening the gap even more, if we're starting another condition of affluence, which is measured or is being seen through this, I'm losing my train of thought a little bit. I'm bouncing around a lot. If we're looking at vaccine passports and considering that as another condition for affluence and something that we can divide the gap and have I hope I'm making sense. I'm struggling to find the words that I'm trying to be delicate with how I'm phrasing things. I don't think successfully, but great, thank you. Making sense. Yeah, essentially, I'm concerned that with vaccine passports, there's going to be there's going to be a bigger gap that we're going to be seeing in the future, and that's something that we can't really predict right now. But I think, just breathe. But I think that that's something that we're going to have to consider when looking at new policies and looking at how to implement change and increase access to aid and healthcare and vaccinations in general, which we are starting to see in Ontario. But yeah, there's quite a few different angles to take in terms of future research. I think with the language that people have adopted, I'm just concerned that a level of acceptance is going to be hard to overcome at some point. I think I'll stop there before I put my foot in my mouth.
And you want to go, Sadie, with future directions for your research?
Yes, absolutely. I think that this specific research interest into the temporary foreign worker program is an interest that is continuously program is continuously changing, which means that research needs to continue to be developed around this area. For example, starting in May this month, they will be allowing access to permanent resident status for the temporary foreign migrant worker program, but only if you do speak English or French fluently and pass a very difficult test, which is an interesting phenomenon that I think should be further explored and critiqued and engaged with critically, because it certainly does require a certain level of affluence to be able to accomplish either one of those, accomplish successfully either one of those tests. So it will be a very interesting project to continue to engage with, as well as the various COVID related data, because there are certainly limitations within the statistics that we currently have available, as migrant laborers have been hesitant to get tested for COVID due to the deportability that they experience within their precarious status in Canada. So this will certainly be an ongoing project that will continue to seek new data, new ways of accessing information. And I'm excited to see where it goes and what happens with this project. But definitely room for the future for improvement in terms of the ways in which data is collected and the ways in which we analyze that data. Which I'm very excited about, and I think it can really expand the boundaries of Canadian policy if enacted by federal and provincial governments. So I will pass it over to Courtney, but I hope that I was substantial enough in that answer.
Thank you, Sadie. That was a good answer. In terms of future directions for research in this topic that I'm exploring, there's sort of three key main areas. One of them being, of course, that a model for actually distributing reparations needs to be considered and developed. And that's something I'm really interested in. Probably the most interesting piece for me is what I talked about earlier about, the sort of real troubling nexus that exists where, even in pre-pandemic days, Black students are disproportionately negatively impacted in the education system, which shapes the kind of life that they're able to fashion for themselves going forward. And the pandemic has only exacerbated this issue insofar as people that are already working in low-wage jobs have fewer access to these jobs at all. And youth are, we have the highest unemployment and also not in training or in school rates that exist that we've had in 20 years. So I think there's this real issue right now that the Canadian state needs to attack, which is that the crisis in social reproduction, particularly for Black youth, could get severely worse, I think, in the years following the pandemic, if not addressed. And so something that I'm interested in researching is really taking stock of Black youth in Canada, be it in a specific age range or what have you, and analyzing and considering what kinds of supports would best help this crisis. And then the last thing I'll say is that I think that because reparations are such a contentious topic in politics and in both academic and personal casual conversations, I'm really interested in exploring a means for implementing them in a way that is really, it's about public consultation. I think that when you can develop an approach that really includes everybody in society into developing a program like this, there's less of a chance that there'll be really fraught disagreement or things like that. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your answers. I have another question here. I guess can you have access to the Q&R section? There is another question here about, it says, anonymous spectator, do you think language such as visible minority and settler colonialism impacts the way race and racism are discussed in the Canadian context?
I'm gonna assume that was for me, so I'm just gonna. Yeah, I do. Short answer, yes. I think in terms of settler colonialism, for sure, I think people assume that it's something of the past. It's not something that is currently still happening. Mind you, I do think that the way that it's happening has changed considerably. Well, maybe not considerably, but it's definitely changed since you know, the British and the French originally came to North America. I think that is there's a different process to it now, but it's definitely an ongoing issue, and it's being presented in certain favoritism. I think when we're looking at the Indigenous community, there's very much, there's a big, I think, oversight in how they're framed as Canadian citizens, and how they're treated in general. But I think that looking at settler colonialism as something that impacts not just Indigenous people in Canada, but all visual minorities, which again has a certain implication to it. I think, like I mentioned in my tried to mention in my previous answer, was that there are certain words that kind of trigger an image or this ingrained idea. And I think part of the harm is that some of those ideas are based off of misinformation. They're based off of narratives of power that have been adopted by Canada. And for example, proposing reconciliation and apologies as a form of repairing cultural genocide is hugely insufficient. But when you hear, oh, well, and I think in that context as well, there is an ahistorical approach being taken, because it's something that happened in the past and we're sorry that it happened back then, but oh, we're better now. And I think that type of conversation needs to be happening a lot more. And that conversation is what needs to be part of daily conversations. It has to be something that is not an academic subject. It should be a Canadian subject, something that happens or something that can be discussed openly with everybody, and not just people who dedicate years to study, which just makes it largely inaccessible. And yeah, I think that answers the question. In terms of visible minority, that does take a little bit of a different tone. But I think during COVID, we're also seeing a lot of changing dialogue and discourse towards a lot of different people. I think we're seeing a huge increase in racism towards Asian people. We're seeing increased racism, both through prejudice, through discrimination, through violence against like I said, against Asian people, against Black people. And I think we're kind of getting to a boiling point where people are starting to pay attention more, but there needs to be more conversation as a starting point. Definitely not a solution, but it's a starting point.
Nice. In the interest of time, Sadie, do you have something to say? And just recall you that we have 9 minutes before we close. So go ahead, please, Sadie.
Thank you, Eloy, for allowing me a turn to speak. I just wanted to address the question further, and I do agree that language does complicate the conversation, and although I do not agree that language should complicate the conversation, it is a prevalent factor, and it is something that continues to perpetuate various issues of inequality because settler colonialism becomes a very loaded word in the Canadian context, a loaded term in the Canadian context. So I do understand those types of questions and those inquiries. I do think that it's important to identify correctly what Canada is and what Canada has done and what Canada continues to do through using the language of settler colonialism, but I can understand politically how that becomes complex and becomes diluted with various differing meanings. And I think that it is an important question to raise, though I do personally completely and wholeheartedly agree that we need to continue to describe Canada's past and Canada's continued actions as that of settler colonialism, because that is both part and parcel of who Canada is. So I hope that I as effectively as possible. And I will pass it over to you, Eloy, or Courtney, or whoever would like to speak next.
I think it's Courtney.
Yeah, and I'm actually glad this question was asked. I do think language is important, and I also think that we tend to stop at language when we're, exploring different solutions to social problems. We tend to change the names of everything and make, hopefully that makes everything better. But in the case of visible minority, particularly, this is why I'm glad that the question was raised. It points to a real systemic issue in Canada, which is that until very, very, very recently, Statistics Canada does not conduct race-based data. So they don't collect race-based data. So when you hear me saying non-visible minority or Indigenous group in my presentation, that's reflective of the fact that there are not category breakdowns about the research. So essentially it's Black Canadians versus non-visible minority or non-Indigenous. In previous research, it was Black Canadians versus the rest of the population. So it's really hard to, sort of get into nuances and explore this research further when there's really not a whole lot of original data to go on and statistics in general.
Excellent. There is just one something that I would like to say is that in the seminar on race, class, and ethnicity, when designing the program, I thought of including concepts that have been actually ignored very much from the academia, and now because it seems something from the past, as Camille was mentioning, and one of those is the concept of racial capitalism. And I'm happy to see that there are a lot of people now recovering that to make sense of what is going on today, because for a long time, Marxian political economy was kind of subjugated as well. It was something from the past, but now we have learned that there are categories that are extremely important to think our present and to our going present. And so I think that part of the work in academia is also to recover, to to revive those forms of knowledge that were subjugated, that were subordinated at some point of history. And also, Catherine Bishoping, I haven't seen, sorry, that you put a question for me, which is, what do people say to you, the people I am talking with, I am working with, I am interviewing, about why they participate in these struggles? You know, basically, fundamentally, it's because of the origins of the moment. You know, people. One of the things that I pictured, I portrayed in my doctoral thesis was precisely that a lot of people in the past, actually most of the people, undocumented people, were not much willing to engage in conversation or in political common projects with people from other ethnicities. The people were kind of very much separated, you know, Mexicans united for regularizations, Guineans from status. So people working in different kind of, you know, ghettos. And now they are more willing to, and basically it's the origins of the moment. We have learned, I think, everybody on the planet, that we need each other, that we are interdependent, and that I think that's one of the reasons why. And you also ask about, you know, what I think it can be my my research plans for the future and what kind of audience. My research plans for the future are this exactly what I'm doing now. I'm just joining the Athabasca University, and part of my research project for this year is precisely to document practice of solidarity in the context of COVID, how strategies to overcome the crisis of social reproduction, the crisis of health, including cooperatives that I have been working on since I was doing my fieldwork in Montreal, you know, co-ops that are created to, under which people conduct work and research, and sorry, no research, but work on the conditions that are not exploitative. And so that's what I'm doing these days. What is my audience? It's important to discuss that. It's a very meaningful question for me. I like science, I like social sciences, and I like to publish in journal articles and have my book in plan and the progress and so on. But I also think that the role of sociology nowadays is that of being a public good, a public sociologist. So my aim, my dream is to really engage with the broader public into what we are producing as sociologists or as a political economist, because I am also a political economist, and to make possible the bridges that may exist between larger publics and people working in the academia. Yeah, that's my answer for your questions. Thank you for your questions. And we have a couple of minutes. If you three want to say something else to close our conversation, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I wanted to just add that I think in terms, coming back to this, in terms of language usage, there's certain terms that people know are, to be reductive, bad. So there's kind of a knee-jerk reaction to be very defensive. And I think that that's something that we're seeing a lot, just to wrap that up. But I am also seeing there's another question regarding regarding Black Canadian reparations. I think this is directed for Courtney. Could you discuss how Black Canadian could be defined? Also, could you discuss options for reparations, and how do you envision reparations actually be distributed in Canada? Which was asked anonymously, by the way.
I don't want to be the tyrant here, but we just have 2 minutes. No?
Sadie, do you want to say some final words, and then I'll say mine and maybe answer that question?
Sure, Courtney, that would be great. I just want to say that it's really our intentions as researchers and as sociologists and political economy students to investigate further the ways in which racism is prevalent within the Canadian context, and really provoke the idea that Canadians are somehow better than the rest of the global context. And I'm very excited to be part of this panelist team, and excited for future endeavors. Thank you very much to the CSA for allowing us to speak. And I'll pass it over to Courtney.
Yeah, so actually kind of a good question to close on. I would define Black Canadian as, I mean, I use it in my research to sort of separate this project from American reparations conversations, which are often more prevalent than Canadian ones. But I think it's important to state that, and that's what I'll close on. The issues that I'm talking about, don't stop at people who are non-citizen and in Canada. As Eloy was talking about, these issues, this crisis in social reproduction exists for Black non-status people who are living in Canada. And the crisis has been heightened by COVID-19. So something I'd like to close on is, the definitions don't stop, don't create, like just because somebody is not a Black Canadian doesn't mean that they don't have rights in Canada. If they're living and working here, I think that they should be included as well. And I'll close there.
Yeah, well, we don't have more time. This is all for today. I want to thank you very much all for your presence. Thanks the Canadian Sociological Association, and thank you very much to Sherry Fox, who has been incredibly helpful in putting together this panel, which I really appreciate. So thank you very much again, and have a nice week.